everybody, it's Mrs. Peachy with another online lesson for summer school biology. So what today we're going to be talking about is the chemistry of life and kind of looking into some basic chemistry that you'll need to know for this biology course. And hopefully I can keep it as simple as possible. So we'll start by looking at the carbon atom, because carbon is the basis of life, and that's why you'll see, carbon as being highly studied in a branch of chemistry known as organic chemistry. Also, if you've ever heard of using carbon dating to figure out how old a fossil is, that would make sense because living things are full of carbon. And by looking at the ratio of two types of carbon to each other in a fossil, we can then kind of look back and figure out about how old that fossil is. What makes carbon a really good molecule for living things is that it has 4 bonding sites. So if you look at a carbon atom, it has 4 places it can bond. And here, this carbon atom has bonded 4 times with hydrogen. Okay, and that's a good thing because that allows carbon to make really long chain complex molecules that are needed for living things. Okay, so I'm going to look at some terms here that hopefully will help you as we move through the units and through this semester in biology. A little bit later on, we're going to be talking about how DNA, which is inside of your cells, how the information stored in DNA is read and used to make things. So the very first thing that's made from that DNA decoding is something called an amino acid. And those are pretty simple. We oftentimes call these guys the building blocks of life. When you string some amino acids together, it's called a peptide. And when you put a lot together, it's called a polypeptide chain. And oftentimes, we can kind of use the term polypeptide chain interchangeably with the word protein. And protein isn't just a long chain of amino acids, but it also has a certain shape to it, a certain geometric configuration that makes it useful for whatever it's set out to do. Whether it's to make your hair, your fingernails, whether it is to serve as a doorway in a cell in order to keep the cell from letting certain things in, the shape of the protein is pretty important. So another term you might hear is the term monomer. Monomer just is it's like part of a polymer. So a bunch of monomers put together make a polymer. A polymer is something very long chained, like DNA, for example, is considered a polymer. Now, there are 4 major macromolecules found in the human body. So this is the stuff your body is going to make. You've got lipids, which you need to eat in order to be able to have lipids in your body to use to make things, such as your cell walls, your cell membranes, excuse me. There are carbohydrates, which you need for energy. There are proteins, which makes a bunch of you, your muscles, your skin, your hair, your nails, among other things. And nucleic acids, which makes the DNA that actually makes everything. So all of these are very important macromolecules. Without them, you'd be dead. So you need those things. Oops. So this picture of a cheeseburger, which looks exceptionally tasty, is made up of a lot of the things that you need to not be dead, including complex carbohydrates, which you use for energy, sugars, which are not complex carbohydrates, which also are used for energy. Polypeptides, these are proteins, which you use for energy as well, but a lot of the the stuff in here helps to make the proteins in your body, and lipids, fats, that you actually do need in order to maintain, well, we call it homeostasis, which is a state of everything being in equilibrium, everything being in balance, and essentially you not being dead. Okay, so in this picture what we have are two of the basic polymers in your body. We have the RNA, which is single-stranded, and we have the DNA, which is double-stranded. So remember, DNA starts with D, and it's double-stranded, which also starts with D. When you look at these two polymers, they are made up of this gray or black line, which is going to be, we're calling this the sugar backbone. And then these little, looks like almost rungs on a ladder. Sometimes DNA is referred to as the twisted ladder. Those are known as nitrogenous bases. They say nucleobases here. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. So here's one of them. This would be considered a nucleotide. A nucleotide is made up of a nitrogenous base and a sugar phosphate group. So the whole deal is considered a nucleotide. So if I look here, if I go back a slide, that would be like taking one rung and a little bit of the backbone with it. That's what I'm looking at in the next slide here. So the sugar and phosphate make up the solid, kind of rigid portion of the DNA. Keeps it, it gives the DNA its shape. And the nitrogenous base is what's kind of coding for information. And this particular base is called adenine. That's one of 4 bases in DNA. This is also called a monomer, a single group, which when you put together forms the polymer of DNA. So monomer is the nucleotide, polymer is the whole DNA. DNA is made up of 2 polymers, or 2 long chains that are bound together, and they're stuck together by what are called hydrogen bonds. Hydrogen bonds are very weak bonds that are easily broken, and they're basically formed because the 2 molecules on either side have slightly different polarity. Think about a north pole and the south pole of a magnet and how they stick together, but you can easily pull the magnets apart. That's kind of the same thing as what's going on here. Now notice that I had mentioned before that this nitrogenous base is adenine. There are 3 other nitrogenous bases in DNA, guanine, cytosine, and thymine, and they're very, very similar. In fact, if you look at adenine and guanine, you know some of the differences here. You have NH2 group rather than just hydrogen, and here's your NH2 over here. So it looks like you just pretty much have an oxygen and a hydrogen, and this is kind of flip-flopped. So very similar to each other. You might wonder what this little guy is doing down here in the corner, uracil. Well, uracil is another nitrogenous base, but it's only found in RNA. If I go back a couple slides, remember that RNA is single-stranded, and instead of using deoxyribose sugar, RNA uses something called ribose sugar. So it just has an extra oxygen group. Okay, so instead of thymine, RNA has uracil. So you just swap those out for RNA. Here again is another protein, which is a macromolecule. Next of our groups, our big macromolecule groups that are important, is lipids. Lipids are fats, and one of the main reasons that we use fats is to make the cell membranes in your cell. Fats do not like water. They're insoluble in water, so if you ever pour oil into water, the oil will float on top and they won't mix. You drop a couple drops of soap in, then they will mix, but that's because it's doing some fun stuff to the bonds. So when you look at a lipid is made up of carbon and hydrogens. In fact, they're also called hydrocarbons, right? And sometimes some oxygens in there as well. And there are saturated and unsaturated fats. Saturated fats have the maximum number possible of hydrogen bonds. Unsaturated fats contain some double bonds. So if you find any double bonds in there, you know it's unsaturated. Some of the easier ways to tell is that unsaturated fats can be liquid at room temperature, like cooking oil, whereas saturated fats are solids at room temperature, like butter. Okay, and of course we have carbohydrates. This is talking of the three types of carbohydrates: monosaccharide, disaccharide, and polysaccharide. Mono meaning one, two for di, many for poly. Doesn't really matter. All it's talking about is whether it's a simple sugar, a kind of simple sugar, or a complex carbohydrate, right? So here we have glucose, very simple. Sucrose and maltose, which are more complicated. And then starch, glycogen, cellulose, which are even more complicated. They're harder to break down. They tend to be larger molecules. And anyways, the cell breaks these down to use as energy in a process called cellular respiration. And we'll talk more about respiration in a different tutorial. Finally, what I want to mention to you is a very important thing called activation energy. Activation energy is something that your body needs to overcome in order to be able to carry out a chemical reaction. Your body's doing tons of chemical reactions all the time. But in order to be able to do those chemical reactions, it has to get the ball rolling, so to speak. If this is kind of an analogy of a chemical reaction. So if the ball has to fall down the hill, which is changing from a reactant to a product, it first has to be shoved up to the top of the hill. So this distance here is considered the activation energy, and it requires energy to move that ball up the hill. I can lower that activation energy. I can make it easier to start the reaction if I have something called a catalyst. A catalyst will speed up a chemical reaction. Natural catalysts or biological catalysts are called enzymes. So you have many different enzymes in your body, and an enzyme is also a protein. So specific or special proteins are called enzymes, which serve as catalysts, which speed up the rate of reactions in your body so that you don't get dead. Because some reactions in your body would take place way too slow to maintain homeostasis. So we absolutely, positively need these enzymes. Alright, that's about it for today. Just a little bit of a preview into what we're going to be talking about in this unit. I will be talking about the properties of water in the next broadcast. And if you have any questions, just, come talk to me. Bye, everyone.